Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay. And you see this, hopefully not my presenter view, but the actual presentation.
Yes, it looks perfect. Thank you.
So today I'm going to talk about a tale of two puffins, and it's an opportunity to compare and contrast two species of puffins. And a lot of people don't think of a rhinoceros auklet as a puffin, but it is. And it also becomes a nice opportunity to think about how these two species face this changing seascape in different ways. And as I'm talking today, I may use I. For everything, it's really we. I work with many, many different people, and I'll be presenting a lot of information that I gather, working with many partners, both here in Washington, and actually I have a number of very close partners up in BC, and then also partners to the south. The presentation that I'm presenting, I'll be presenting my pictures if they're unlabeled. You'll see a lot of pictures that are Peter Hodum's. Peter is a partner with me on my research. He is a faculty at the University of Puget Sound. He also studies seabirds and has been for many decades, starting with work in the Antarctic and Chile, and then his current work still in Chile, and then also up here. But if I stole a picture from the web, you'll see it, and I will label it. Otherwise, if they're unlabeled, they're mine, and I'm responsible for their poor quality. So in terms of the outline of today's talk, I want to introduce you to the coastal environment. Even though I'm focusing on Washington, it's very similar to what you have on the other side of the border. I'll start in the Salish Sea and then move out to the coastal environment with a focus on the California current large marine ecosystem. And then I'll talk a bit about what is a puffin. I'll compare and contrast the patterns between these species in terms of comparing and contrasting the tufted puffin to the Rhinoceros auklet in terms of its distribution, their reproduction, their diet, their habitat use. And then I'll talk a bit about the conservation status of both and talk a bit about the future. And of course, there'll be some time for questions. So when I talk about the Salish Sea, it's not unfamiliar to all of you. And just so to be clear, I'm talking about the collection of the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound. And I know some people get concerned about using the term Salish Sea, but boy, it's a lot easier than saying all three of those names over and over again. We'll start now in the Salish Sea, and it's an environment near and dear to all of you. And it's a varied environment. It in many cases is very well developed, like on Vancouver, Seattle, many of them are urban areas. So a lot of houses along our waterfront, a lot of modification of our shoreline, but it's also a place that's very important to us, and it's important to our seabirds. And there are a couple islands in the Salish Sea, three in particular. I'm going to focus on two on the US side of the border, but I'm not going to talk about Mandardi on the north side of the border, but those three in particular really have almost all of the seabirds in the Salish Sea in terms of the breeding populations. We're talking about 90-some% are breeding on those three islands alone. Perhaps, I mean, pigeon guillemots are well distributed throughout the Salish Sea, so it's a little hard to account for those, but really those islands have the bulk of the birds. And one in particular has the vast majority, and that's Protection Island, which you see here. This island is about 3.5 kilometers long by about a kilometer and a half wide. And it's mostly grass dominated, like you see here, but it actually does have forests on the backside. And then there's Smith Island, which actually is very similar in terms of its geology, is also a very important seabird nesting site. Both of these sites have rhinoceros auklets on them. Protection Island has over 35,000 pairs of rhinoceros auklets on it. This island has several thousand pairs of rhinoceros auklets, as well as they have black oyster catchers, gulls, cormorants, etc., breeding on. And in terms of where the two islands that I've been mostly focusing on, Protection and Smith, are located, you can see protection island here, just off of Squim and Dungeness bays at the very eastern end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And then Smith Island is located kind of off of Whidbey and a little bit south of the San Juans. And quite a bit smaller than protection. But both have really nice soils for burrow nesting seabirds and don't have a lot of rock, which is quite different from the San Juans and all the islands to the north. Fortunately, both of these islands are protected by the National Wildlife Refuge Complex, and protection also has a state, part of it is also state property. So it's protected between the National Wildlife Refuge and the state property. There's one last private house on Protection Island, and there was a recent article about him. It's worth looking at. It was in the New York Times not very long ago. It's kind of an interesting article about him. And these islands, as I said, are riddled with holes, which you see here on the left. Can you see my pointer if I point? Yeah, okay. You can see holes throughout this island on the top and then on the slopes. And those are mostly Rhinoceros auklets, but a few tufted puffins as well. On the shores, you'll find black oyster catcher nests, gulls, etc. And then as we move out of the Strait of Juan de Fuca and move to the outer coast, and this environment's quite a bit different. It's much more stormy, it has large swells, and it has a really different world compared to the inland waters. And if you look off of Cape Flattery from towards Tetouche, here you can see that there are a variety of offshore rocks and islands off the Washington coast, off the northern Washington coast, just like you have off of Vancouver Island. Tetouche is a real important seabird colony, and it has been an important spot for studying seabirds for a long time. This island, unlike most of the islands off of our shore, is managed by the Macaw tribe and belongs to the Macaw tribe. All the other offshore rocks and islands in Washington are pretty much part of the National Wildlife Refuge Complex. And the rocks and offshore islands have different importance to birds depending on how close they are to shore. Closer to shore, usually it's not a good thing for seabirds because that means that things like raccoons and various predators, river otters, can get to them. Also, whether they're vegetated or not, and their geologic history can have a big impact on whether or not the island is suitable for seabirds. And some of them have well-developed soils and will have burrow nesting seabirds, and others will have very steep, cliffy kind of surfaces, and those will be important for surface nesting species like cormorants and common murres. In islands like this, can have a mixture. This is Carroll Island off the Washington coast. This cave in here is actually full of California sea lions barking, and they echo and they come out. On top of here, you have nesting tufted puffins and several others. Storm petrels also nest here. And then on the cliff faces over here, we find many hundreds of common murres. And then we have other islands, like this is Alexander Island, which I was fortunate to get onto recently. Has very, very steep rocky sides, but when you get up on top, you get this tufted hairgrass kind of community, similar to what you find on portions of Triangle Island off the coast of Vancouver Island. And these tufts are really important in maintaining and holding the soil. And they're actually interesting. They're pedestals that are about a meter or a meter and a half in diameter. And they're almost a meter deep along the sides. And so as you're walking through here, there's sort of this gully between each one. And if you look at the base of each pedestal, they'll be ringed with burrow nesting seabirds. So this island here has a lot of Cassin's auklets, but also has a lot of fork-tailed storm petrels, as well as tufted puffins and Rhinoceros auklets on it. And of course, that intertidal rocky shore we're all familiar with is just gorgeous. And the animals found there are just so much fun to see. And then, of course, there are mammals on our shoreline. In the 1970s, we reintroduced the species that had been extirpated from Washington state. And we brought in the first animals back into Washington from Alaska. And they have been growing at a very rapid rate, and we have a rapidly recovering population that actually has been spilling over into British Columbia and perhaps maybe spilling over to the south as well. And they're fun to watch. They're kind of neat animals, and you can, on certain islands, you can actually get quite close to them. And then, of course, we have our pinnipeds, our seals and sea lions. Harbor seal, we all know well. Here's that young harbor seal about ready to be weaned, looking fat and happy. And then we have our stellar sea lions off the offshore rocks, off the Olympic Peninsula here. California sea lions, which visit us when they're not breeding, and sites further south. And then, of course, that rocky shoreline is important to species, some of which you've already mentioned today. Harlequin duck. We can see our turnstones, both the black and ruddy, you see here. And then you find the seabirds using these islands as well. Pigeon guillemot is probably quite familiar to all of you. A burrow nesting seabird also nests in crevices and will also nest in human-made structures. I've seen them go into a portal on a boat, a ship that was abandoned and sitting there, and they were happy to use that as a nesting site. So they definitely use those. They tend to be more dependent on nearshore environment during the breeding season, and they bring back a lot of sculpin and blennies. So very nearshore fish during the breeding season. They're quite loud, and they like to vocalize. Another bird that also likes to vocalize is quite loud on the outer coast are your black oyster catchers, and we see them, and they're actually very active all night. You hear them at 12 midnight, you hear them at 2 a.m., you hear them at 3 a.m. During the breeding season, they seem to be as active at night as they are during the day. And they nest on the shoreline. They're very vulnerable to human activity. That's why you tend to find them on islands where you don't have humans. It's rare they're on areas with people. Those eggs can be crushed easily. People being around them will flush them off their nests, and they won't do very well around people. And of course, they're the predators that feed off of these seabirds, like the peregrine falcon. And this one has grabbed a shorebird right off in front of me when I was on Destruction Island doing tufted puffin observations, and then flew off to the side. Then we have our surface nesting seabirds. You find things like the Brandt's cormorant you see here. Then we see on Tatoosh Island, you see here, these are the common murres, each one with a single egg along these cliff faces. And then as we get on a boat and go up further out into the water and away from the shore and start to look at what we might see and detect out there, in the more nearshore environment during the breeding season, we tend to find things like the Rhinoceros auklet and common murres. But then as we eventually get to that continental shelf and where that drops off and you eventually get into those deep canyons in the blue water, and that's when we get into the world of the tube noses, like here's a Laysan albatross. I think this picture somewhere, probably almost into Canadian waters when I took this shot. There's a black-footed albatross, the other common albatross on our offshore waters. Just gorgeous to watch them fly and to watch how they just lock those wings and soar. And this one, I just took this picture last week. I was offshore on a pelagic survey, and this black-footed albatross had gotten fish off the surface. I'm sure it didn't kill it. It probably found it. It was a halibut opener. And I think this is probably a bycaught fish that this albatross is taking advantage of. And then there's the shearwaters, city shearwater, like you see here, and the short-tailed shearwater, like was mentioned earlier. We tend to see them more further offshore, but they also can come in quite close to shore in certain years. In some years, we almost see this conveyor belt like movement of sooty shearwaters and other species moving up off the shore, just many tens and hundreds of thousands moving along our shores. And it's amazing to watch. And they tend to be focused on things like anchovy and other species of fish on the offshore. And then as you get offshore, you tend to also see really special things. You might see blue shark, like I'm pictured here. On this particular trip, I probably saw 25 of them. And then every so often you get something really special, like a leatherback turtle. This one's probably off the central Washington coast when I took this shot. And then a pinniped we don't see very much unless you get off into that pelagic environment, or the northern fur seal and the Guadalupe fur seals are off our coasts, both Washington and British Columbia. And a lot of people always just call them northern fur seals. Recently, we've been taking pictures of them and trying to determine each one that we're detecting, whether it's a Guadalupe or northern. Most of them are northern fur seals, but a subset of them are actually Guadalupe fur seals. And of course, it's the world of the cetaceans out there where you start to see humpback whales, and then riding on your bow, you might be lucky and have Pacific white-sided dolphins. And then off in that offshore environment in the middle of the winter, you could encounter this, the tufted puffin. And the tufted puffin, almost no one ever sees it in this plumage. And that's why I'm not showing a picture of my own. I took one, stole one off the web that Brian Sullivan took. But a really nice shot here of a tufted puffin in the non-breeding plumage. And you notice how different it looks from a normal tufted puffin, which we'll see in a minute. And I happened to actually take this one last week on the offshore environment. This bird was probably about 30 kilometers offshore. Horrible shot, but I wanted to share it anyway because you can see that orange beak and that black body, and you can see how different it looks from your typical tufted puffin. But it is a tufted puffin. So let's start to focus on the two species and talk a bit about what is a puffin. And I'm going to present a tree, a phylogeny. This is like a family tree that you might look at for humans. This shows the pattern of ancestry and descent in one particular group of birds, a family of birds known as the Alcididae or the alcids. And the puffins are in that group. And usually you have a family like this, you're looking at the relationship amongst these different individuals or the individual species. And usually then the tree is rooted by an outgroup, and that's these two down here. And so they're not related to your alcids, but they help root this tree when you're doing genetic studies. And then when we look at this group, you can see this group, this family has everything from dovekies and razorbills to murres and murrelets to auklets, and finally the puffins. And the puffins are down here at the bottom. And you notice that the rhinoceros auklet's right there with the other puffins. And the rhinoceros auklet of the puffins is the most basal member of that group. And then the other puffins then branch out from there and are more closely related. The next one branching out is the tufted puffin, which you see here. And then you see the two sister taxa, the ones that are much more closely related to each other, the Atlantic puffin here and the horned puffin here. And notice how close the Atlantic and the horned puffin look to each other, much more similar in plumage to each other than they do to either the rhino or the tufted puffin. And of course, we don't get Atlantic puffins here. Boy, if we did, I'd like to see it. But the horned puffin is a regular breeder in British Columbia and in Alaska. They don't breed in Washington, although recently several have been hanging out throughout the whole breeding season, which makes me, and I've watched them go into burrows on a colony in Washington. So I wonder if one day they may start breeding down there. But that bird was hanging out with a tufted puffin, so I think it's probably out of luck. So let me compare and contrast the patterns of between rhinoceros auklet and tufted puffins. And let's start with distribution and start with the tufted puffin. And the tufted puffin is found from, in terms of the breeding range, actually all the way down to the Farallon Islands in California, where they still have active breeding colonies, all the way up through Oregon and Washington, through British Columbia, up through Alaska, all the way out into Russia and over to Japan. And that's where their breeding range, and it's very coastal during that time. And then during the non-breeding range, you notice this is this blue area, and we really don't have any idea where they are up there. We know they're out there somewhere, but we have really no good information on where these tufted puffins go during the winter. We know they're not in the near shore. We know they're far offshore, but we don't know where. Here's the rhinoceros auklet to compare, and you notice its distribution. It is also found from California all the way across through the Aleutians and all the way over into Japan. But what's a little bit different about the species is during the winter, it tends to be a little more near shore, although some recent information from Mark Hiffner will change this blue shading soon. The other thing is the center of gravity, if you will, for where the majority of these rhinoceros auklets are, is really British Columbia and just going into Washington. So we have one of, with Protection Island, one of the 10 largest rhinoceros auklet colonies in the world. But all the rest in terms of size are either couple colonies over here, and all the rest are in British Columbia. And then as you get up into Alaska, the numbers actually get quite a bit fewer. In contrast, the tufted puffins, the center of gravity, if you will, for their breeding populations is here in the Aleutians. The vast majority of them are here. So a little bit different distribution. So I mentioned that Mark Hiffner's work, Mark is with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we collaborated on a study with him on this work here, where a variety of, and we had a very small role in that. Mark and actually his team did the vast majority of the work. Put out transmitters on a variety of different birds on a variety of different colonies, and looked at where they spent their year. And as you can see, when you go to the north up here, up in Alaska, you can see that these birds are actually, some of them are wintering in the Gulf of Alaska, but some of them are coming way down into California waters. You see that with birds from Middleton Island in terms of where they're going. Again, these are Gulf of Alaska birds. Then you're going down to St. Louis area. Now we're off the coast of British Columbia, Lucy. We're at Haida Gwaii, and then Triangle, Pine, Cleland, Protection, this island I mentioned earlier, and then Destruction off the outer coast of Washington, and then down to the Farallones, and then down on to Nuevo. And you can see that as you get further south, they tend to hang out further south, but there's a lot more overlap as you get from Protection north in terms of their distribution during the winter. Thinking about tufted puffins in terms of where they breed, in Washington, this is where the colonies were and are. The historical colonies are in yellow. You can see the Salmon Islands used to have a lot of historical colonies. There are 2 extant colonies in the Salish Sea, that's Protection and Smith Islands, which I've already introduced you to. And there are no tufted puffin colonies that I'm aware of on the Canadian side of the border in the Salish Sea. There's discrepancy in terms of whether or not they bred on a couple of the islands there. And there's not, for all of these islands, there's not great historical information. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, or actually I'm going to talk about that right now. Louise Blight, who is, I think, on this, is in the audience at the moment, and with Greg McClelland, recently submitted a paper that was just accepted and will be published soon. And they're looked at the status of puffins in British Columbia. And here you can see where the colonies used to be, and there's not a designation between where they used to be and where they are. They found records of about 19 historical colonies, including a few that people recently didn't realize were in the historic record. And of those 19, I think about 19 are no longer occupied. So about 10 left, if I'm remembering correctly, and hopefully later during the question and answers, Louise will correct me if I'm wrong. And they've been mostly disappearing from the smaller colonies. So the colonies with just a few individuals have disappeared. And we found the same thing in Washington. The bigger colonies tend to be hanging on. The smaller colonies tend to be disappearing. And then if in contrast, we can look here at rhinoceros auklets and where all of the rhinos are in our world. And you can see these are the biggies. These islands here that are starred, and you can see almost all of them are in British Columbia, and then one is in Washington. And these are really the most important. And these colonies If anything, we're seeing some evidence of population growth in rhinoceros auklets. And where are they? Where do they go to forage during the breeding season? Well, we can look at sea distribution data, and we can model that and come up and create these predictive density surfaces. And a red color indicates higher density, and a colder color indicates a lower density. And I'm sorry, this is actually not great for people who are colorblind, probably, but this nearshore environment is lit up, and that's because that's where the colonies are in Washington. And then there's this offshore area just at the continental shelf break, where apparently some of them at least are foraging in this area and maybe going out here either when their partner's in incubating, or they may be actually carrying food from the continental shelf back in to feed their young. Oh, and here's the rhinoceros auklet in contrast. You can see the nearshore is lit up, but the offshore is not at all. So they're really, during the breeding season, they're very nearshore in their distribution, both in terms of foraging and where their nest sites are. So let's go out and to a couple of the colonies where I spent most of my time. Let's talk about Destruction Island on the outer coast out here, and we'll compare that, some of the results on Protection Island. And as I mentioned, all of my work that I'm working on is always done with partnerships. And so most of the work I'm doing on Washington colonies being done in collaboration with these groups, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, University of Puget Sound, Oikonos, my agency, NOAA, and then the Center for Ecosystem Sentinels at the University of Washington. And in terms of when they're breeding here, they're burrow nesters, as I indicated. They dig a burrow into the soil, and they dig that burrow with that beak, and they lay a single egg in that burrow. This is actually a crevice nest. This is borrowed from the internet, and one of the reasons you can get a picture of this is it's not very deep. You can actually just poke a camera in there and take a picture. They can be not very deep, half a meter or to a meter, or they can be actually a couple meters deep, depending on the burrow. In general, I find that tufted puffin burrows are bigger than like a rhinoceros auklet, and they tend to be shallower and they tend to be straighter. And then here's the rhinoceros auklets on Protection Island. You can see that the island itself is riddled with holes. This slope right here is where this picture is taken, and it's just covered with these holes. And as I mentioned, these birds will dig in there. This is a bird I happened to capture digging a hole on Jagged Island. So it's digging it with that beak, carrying out rocks and material. But most of the material is moved out with those back feet, and they'll actually kick it out. And you see these clouds of dust coming out of the hole when they're digging their burrows. In terms of lining their nests, both the rhino pretty regularly brings in some nesting material. It tends to be plant material from the island itself that it's nesting on. So it tends to be grasses and other plants that are found on the island that it'll bring in. This picture is an oddball. This particular tufted puffin was bringing in seagrass to line its nest. I've never looked in a burrow and actually seen seagrass lining the nest. And then, as I mentioned, they lay a single egg, both species do. The adults take turns, probably about 24-hour shifts in terms of incubating the eggs, and that goes on for about a month. And then that chick will hatch, and then they, at that point, they will both end up provisioning that young. Here you can see moderately well-developed rhinoceros auklet chick. You can see that little bump of the rhino horn here on this one. It's how you can distinguish it. The beak looks pretty different between the two chicks when you look at them in the burrow. Most seabirds return to the same colony, and often to the exact same burrow. And in burrow nesting seabirds, the pair bond is often formed around that burrow. In particular species that aren't staying together year round. Marble murrelets are kind of an exception to that group, in that you tend to find the murrelets often are paired, and they often remain paired throughout the year. A species like tufted puffins they tend to be separate, and then they come back together at that burrow. And an ongoing study that a bunch of us are collaborating on with Teresa Berg at the University of Lethbridge. We've been sending her samples from Alaska, from British Columbia, and from Washington and Oregon. And she's starting to look at the genetic structure of tufted puffins. What's interesting is that you can actually start to compare the genetic structure. So all you need to know here is that these colors here represent different colonies. We have colonies in British Columbia here, we have colonies in Alaska. And you notice that the colors separate somewhat. They overlap somewhat, but they also separate. And that suggests that there's actually structure among colonies. And that's because birds tend to return to the exact same colony year after year. And so you tend to be more closely related to the other birds on that colony. In terms of the social interactions, when these birds return and they're on the colony, you tend to find a lot of social and mate interactions on the surface. And you see there's a lot of stretching, there's a lot of wing flapping, and you tend to see birds paired up. This is a picture from Destruction Island, and birds will be in their pairs and they'll be right outside of their burrow. And birds can be, this pair right here is probably doing what we call bill claps, is what I call them. And so they actually come together and they clap their beaks. And they'll do that. They'll sometimes do some almost like chattering with their beaks, but no sound is really coming out. They're not vocal. Tufted puffins are incredibly quiet, and there's really almost no vocalizations. The only time I really hear anything from them is as they're flying off, you hear this moaning sound as they're taking off, and this sort of this sound as they're flying off. But other than that, during these interactions, they're pretty much quiet. And they do a lot of that sort of silly clown walk, I call it. Kind of doing the left foot and right foot, almost like a booby. I don't know if people have seen blue-footed and red-footed boobies, when they're doing their mate displays, they'll kind of display, this is my right foot, and oh, here's my left foot. And these guys do that a little bit too, and do what we call the silly clown walk. It's kind of a wobble back and forth and a strutting around on the colony. And then what I want to do is actually contrast that with rhinos. So you notice that all my pictures I was showing for tufted puffins were during the day, and tufted puffins only really return to the colony during the day. And in contrast, the rhinoceros auklet only comes to the colony at night. And so the only way to capture rhinoceros auklet activity is to be there at night, or to have remote cameras like you see here. And here we see a rhinoceros auklet vocalizing, and they're very vocal. The sound at night on a rhino colony is amazing. All of this moaning and groaning sound. There's a really nice, if you Google bird note and rhinoceros auklet, there's some recordings on that particular recording that I got from Protection Island that they provide. And it's really fun to listen to their sounds. But you can see there's a lot of social activity as well in the rhinos. You can see this and captured in this video. These colonies are very busy, a lot of synchronous up and down with necks and moaning, and some of that bill-to-bill interaction. And this is all in one night, I should point out. We also sometimes have introduced exotic species. This island actually has the European rabbit, which is actually a hare, a real problem, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. That's been introduced. And then right behind where those rhinos we're displaying is a tufted puffin burrow, which is what this camera was intended to capture. And you can see it in the middle of the night, they're actually incredibly active, which I didn't realize how active they were. At all hours of the night, they're coming in and out of their burrows. They're not flying off, but they're spending time on the surface outside of the burrow. And of course, the rabbits are there. And then, of course, they're bald eagles, and they come in regularly and are harassing these seabirds. And you can see that. I can see that the talon here of a bald eagle, of a juvenile bald eagle. And then one way we study them, people used to do a lot of grubbing, which we call digging into the burrow and tearing it apart, and then getting to the chick, and then doing the measurements and all of that, and then maybe putting tiles or pieces of wood over the part of the burrow you destroyed. We tend to prefer using these fiber optic burrow probes. It's a fiber optic camera that's snaked into the burrow, and we have a gaming visor, which you see Eric has on his face, and he can actually see the inside of the burrow, and we're snaking into the burrow. And rhinoceros auklet burrows are ridiculously long and complicated. In contrast to the tufted puffin, they get in and they bifurcate. And so you go down the right side. That one might, again, bifurcate. And you go down those and they may have little chambers. And it's like being in the catacombs. It's an amazing underground world. And probably because they're using these burrows year after year. And for some reason, they feel the need to keep adding on. It's just like an ongoing house project. And one way we monitor them, we just label burrows, and we can observe them from a distance as well. And we do this more with tufted puffins because we're very concerned about tufted puffins. They're really vulnerable to human disturbance, and they're inclined to abandon, particularly early in the incubation period. So we don't use the burrow probes early on with them. We tend to use a hands-off approach and watch them from afar. And then later, when the chicks are about ready to hatch or after they've just hatched, then we might check them with the burrow probes, and we don't have them abandoned at that point. So we tend to use a real different approach just based on how the birds respond to us. Both species are bill load provisioners. So that what they're doing is bringing bill loads of fish back to feed their chicks. And that bill load can be 1 to many, and many can be well over 20 fish in a single bill load. Here you can see a bill load coming in on Protection Island that looks to me to be 100% sand lands. Protection Island and a number of the islands to the north, like Pine and Lucy, are mostly sand lance, and herring is the primary diet for these species there. And here's a single bill load. And then what we can do is, for the rhino, is we'll startle them at night as they return. We'll collect that bill load. We'll learn as much as we can about that bill load. We've done a plastic study looking at microplastics in the fish that we did with Mark Kitchener. We look at how many calories the chick's getting, what's the average weight, what's the average amount of calories per bill load, some of those kind of metrics. And as I mentioned for the tufted puffin, here's Peter doing observations from afar. And again, we can look at the bill load coming in. But again, we're not as keen to do anything hands-on with them because of their susceptibility to abandon. So what we're doing is using high-resolution digital SLR photos, so single lens reflex kind of photos. It could be doesn't have to be a SLR, but anyway, it has to be a high-quality camera with a very high-quality lens. And we can start getting information about that bill load. And we can figure out how many fish it has. And then a recent project with a student of Peter's where she started looking at what's the average fish length, how does that change between years, and how many fish, for example. We can also often put these fish into species categories or into actual species. It's hard when you have embryonic fish like these. These are very young fish. You can actually see through them. It's often hard to figure out what species they are when they're young like that. And you can see that sometimes they're only bringing back one or a couple fish, like the smelt in this one. And we find that for tufted puffins, they tend to be bringing back forage fish, squid, and krill. And they tend to be foraging where the currents coastline, where their currents are concentrating fish. So when I compare the two, we find in terms of the breeding range, the Rhinoceros auklet is further south in terms of where the majority of them are. It tends to be more in British Columbia and Washington. For tufted puffin, it tends to be further north, with the vast majority up in Alaska. Habitat use during the breeding season, it's near shore for the rhino. It's more offshore. There are tufted puffins that forage in the near shore as well. So it's kind of more of a mix, I would call it here. During the non-breeding season, they're both pretty far offshore in general. We do see rhinos in the nearshore environment during the winter, although there are not nearly as many around during the winter, and many of them are far offshore. Colony activity, nocturnal for the rhino, diurnal during the day for the tufted puffin. In terms of diet, very similar diets. And in terms of population size, we're finding that the tufted puffin seems to be declining and the rhino seems to be increasing, or at least holding its own. And when we've looked at reproductive success, we find that tufted puffins don't do that well compared to the rhino. So what does that mean for conservation status? I was recently contracted by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do a range-wide assessment of puffins. And I worked with a variety of partners, and we had gathered data only in North America. And we gathered data all the way. This is where our data set extended from the Farallones all the way to the tip of the Aleutians. And then we started looking at trends. And here we're just looking at the trends just in Washington. And you can see that going way back, so we're starting back here in the early 1900s and going to today, this population has been going down over time. And the populations, some of the bigger declines actually occurred farther back in the past than more recently, but we're still seeing these really strong negative declines. And we're seeing that occupancy status is changing, where we're having fewer occupied sites, and that range appears to be contracting. And the work that Louise just completed seems to show similar pattern in British Columbia as well. As a result of that, we ended up listing the tufted puffin in Washington as endangered. And this listing package is available online. You can find it if you want. This was a really nice public-private partnership where we worked with the Sea Dock Society on this project. Then we ended up doing a recent status review, the 5-year status review. Based on that, it was actually both a combination of a status review and a recovery plan. And it's the first time we did that, where we combined both the status review and the recovery plan. And we hope that that will guide the conservation strategy for the puffin going forward. There are a lot of things that are affecting puffins, and we're not really sure which one it is, and maybe it's really a combination of factors. There are everything from decline in forage fish, which is of course related to things like increases in sea surface temperature. Sea level rise, I'm not as concerned about for tufted puffins currently. It could be in the future. Increase in ocean acidity has the potential to disrupt the food chain. Other factors we're certainly seeing is avian predation, particularly by bald eagles. We're seeing bald eagles are recovering dramatically all along in North America. And as a result, they're having a pretty dramatic effect on seabirds. And some people say, well, aren't they just coming back to their historic numbers? And they probably are, yes. But they're also recovering in a very changed environment. I like to say, well, I like to think about what it was like historically for eagles when they could go after probably their preferred prey, which was mostly salmon. We used to have a lot of salmon runs. We used to have an awful lot of salmon. And those salmon runs would be coming at all different times of the year. And those runs are no longer there. The numbers have gone way down. And as a result, we may be seeing eagles spending more time on things like seabirds and ducks. We certainly have more issues with human disturbance, and that becomes a real issue in places like the Salish Sea, and that's probably why we only have 2 remaining colonies in the Salish Sea. And it's not surprising those 2 colonies essentially have no humans on them and are protected. We're also seeing problems with introduced plants and animals, and we're seeing evidence of plastic and chemical pollution. And I think sea surface temperature is the one thing I worry about the most. This is a complicated slide put together by the coast folks. And what you're looking at is hot and cold, hot colors meaning warmer temperatures. And here's the timeline from 2006 to 2020. And we're looking California to California, so central to Northern California, Washington, Oregon, Gulf of Alaska, Bering, South Bering, North Bering, Chukchi Sea. And these dots represent what we call unusual mortality events, these big circles. And the size of it indicates how big it is. And what we're finding is there's more and more of these unusual mortality events occurring when the sea surface temperature is warmer. We're also finding that these events are occurring more frequently in the alcid family. So that family that includes puffins. And so we're seeing that's affecting that group disproportionately. And an event we had not too long ago in Washington and British Columbia was an unusual mortality event with rhinoceros auklets. And that occurred starting in June here, July, August, September. And you can see the dots, again, the size of the dot indicates how many dead carcasses are on the shore and where they are. And you can see them on both sides of the border. So we've pooled the US and Canadian data here to show an overall picture of this mortality event. So what are the recovery priorities? Right now, we want to continue to monitor, and we actually want to do a better job of monitoring. The historical monitoring is done in a way where it's really hard to quantify trends. And I think Louise found that, I certainly found that. So we actually have a group that's assembling to try to figure out how to develop a better monitoring strategy range-wide. We want to maintain our existing colonies. We also maybe want to consider establishing new ones. There's been real success in doing that in the Atlantic with the Atlantic puffin. And we also want to make sure that we have adequate prey, and we're protecting the spawning habitat for forage fish. We want to reduce disturbance and contaminants in our system. All of these activities are going to help. There's also introduced animals like European rabbits were introduced to destruction, and they were introduced by lighthouse keepers. And European rabbits is one of the most widely introduced animals to islands throughout the world. Over 800 islands throughout the world have introduced European rabbits. Again, that's a hare, so they actually develop warrens and they dig down in and have burrow systems. Imagine if you have something with burrow systems that's on islands with other animals that also have burrow systems. That creates conflict. They also dramatically change the vegetation. Here we're looking in Australia down here at the bottom where you have an exclosure. And look at the difference between the non-exclosed world out here where rabbits are grazing and areas in here where the rabbits are not grazing. A dramatic change in the vegetation structure, which has implications to perhaps reproduction and survival of those animals. And there is evidence suggested both from pink-footed shearwaters and Atlantic puffins that the rabbits actually have a real negative effect on reproduction. On destruction, we're seeing where the rabbits have been, that the island is eroding, and we're losing all of that burrow nesting habitat. And we have removed them in the past from islands. Smith Island, who I've already introduced you to that island, off of Whidbey. That island had European rabbits on it. And they were removed in the 1920s using strychnine gas, cyanide gas. And I wouldn't do that today, but it was effective. And actually, there are no European rabbits on this island today. So it's been done in the past. It's been done successfully. There are groups that do it wisely, like Island Conservation. They're very effective at it. So I've been jabbering on way too long. So let me spend a minute answering your questions if you have them.
Okay, so if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat and I will relay it. That was a great talk, Scott. Thanks so much. And I remember you apologizing for quality of the photos at the beginning. There was absolutely no need of that. You have some fantastic photos.
Thank you. I love taking pictures. Peter, fortunately, is a very good photographer as well. This is a picture that Peter took on Tatoosh Island.
So any questions for Scott? This group is usually kind of chatty. I'm surprised I'm not hearing a lot of questions.
I have a question. I came in late, so you may have addressed this, but as just a bird enthusiast, where would you be able to? I live on Vancouver Island. Where would you be able to see puffins, tufted puffins, or is it even possible?
In the Salish Sea, the only spots are some of the tours that go to Smith Island and Protection Island. I can't remember if any of the ones out of Victoria currently go there. I have seen those boats over there, so some of the whale watching boats will also visit, particularly Smith, because Smith is not that far. It's not, for a high-speed whale watching boat, it's not that hard to get there. So I know the Victoria boats, sometimes they have gone there. And you certainly see them going out of Port Townsend to both of those spots. So those are the two common spots where I see tours. In terms of proximity to shore, I don't know. I wish I knew the Vancouver Island coast better and whether there's a good spot, and maybe someone else would be able to give you advice there. In terms of in Oregon and Washington, the only spot I know that's a good spot is Haystack Rock in Oregon, and it's a great spot to actually observe them from the beach. And that rock is quite close to shore, and you can get people get pretty high quality photos there. It's one of the few spots where you can just be standing in knee deep water and taking photos of puffins.
Yeah.
Thanks.
For Vancouver Island, they are mostly flybys and by chance.
Yeah.
If you happen to have access to a boat, as Lauren is putting in here, the Brooks Peninsula, the Solander Island area, Cleland Island off Tofino.
Yeah.
These are all places that you can get to by boat, but occasionally they are seen from the Victoria waterfront, mostly from Harling Point, the Chinese cemetery down that way, watching for bait balls really, and looking who comes in, but they're usually at great distance and a scope is generally required. And honestly, it's not incredibly satisfying.
Yeah.
I was wondering about the burrowing.
Yep.
And so do they mostly just rehabilitate old burrows, or when do they decide that it's time to go and dig a new burrow? Or sort of how long will they stay in one burrow before they decide it's time to move home and start something new?
I don't know the answer to that for sure, but we do know that the birds we've been studying are coming back to the same burrow for many years. And I suspect they use that same burrow for decades. They're long-lived birds, and that pair bond, because it's formed around that burrow, they're just returning to it. The only time they seem to build new burrows is if their burrow is collapsed, which happens periodically. Like on Protection Island, there are black-tailed deer have gotten out there by swimming out there, and they collapse burrows pretty regularly. So they'll be forced to and those burrows that have been collapsed have mostly been Rhinoceros Auklets, not so much the Tufted Puffins, because they're on the steeper cliff. And the other time you see new burrows is just if it's a young birds. So you have prospecting birds, and we'll see them actually digging throughout the nesting season. So that season they're actually not nesting, and they're either going into burrows that are not occupied, and they're working on those, or they're starting a new burrow.
So an existing couple, they might just sort of rehabilitate their existing burrow as part of the courtship.
Yep.
That's what happens.
Yep, exactly. And for example, those tags that Mark and the rest of us put on the birds on Rhinoceros Auklets, we put them by capturing them at the burrow at night. So use a purse net that's designed for capturing rabbits. It's actually designed for capturing European hares. They sell them in the UK, and so you can order them. I've ordered them from Ireland, and those you capture them at night in their burrow, and it's a specific burrow, and you put the tag on them 1 year, and you wait till the next year, and you recapture the exact same burrow, the bird in the exact same burrow, and then you download the data from that tag.
Okay, thanks.
Scott, there's a question from Susan McRae. She says all that burrowing must eventually erode the island. Would that be a reason that colonies are abandoned?
That can happen, yes. I mean, obviously, everything is eroding over time, and except where we have uplifting and building. That erosion occurs much more quickly under certain conditions. So yes, it is eroding, and it would naturally erode. But certain things enhance that and really increase it exponentially. We see that with the European rabbit, and we see that with non-native grasses. So once that island, so I remember I showed you that island with a nice big tufts of hair grass.
Mm-hmm.
Those are perennial grasses, and they are deeply rooted. And imagine our coasts, our outer coast during the middle of winter. You could have 25 foot swells, and say you on top of that, you have 8 or 9 foot wind waves. And that's blasting against that island. And say it's huge winds, maybe 100 kilometers or greater. And those grasses actually hold it in place. And in many islands where people have been and spent time, those grasses are replaced by non-native annual grasses. An annual grass is not deeply rooted, and by definition is reseeding itself every year. And so as a result, they're not holding the soil. And we're seeing this much more rapid erosion.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Scott, if you want to stop sharing, then we can see your face. Oh, and here's another note from Kevin. You mentioned the possibility of starting new colonies. What criteria would you look for? What locations are more preferable for nesting? Any key things that are unique, required, or even surprising in the needs of a site?
It's a good question. We just started discussing this. We just had a meeting about this just actually 2 weeks ago and just started this discussion. And a variety of factors we're thinking about. One is how close is the island to a predator source, particularly river otters. As you are all probably keenly aware, river otters are good at getting to a variety of spots. And the more offshore the island is, the less accessible, at least at a regular basis, from river otters. I have seen river otters as far as, 3 or 4 kilometers offshore. But they tend to be, that's odd, they tend to be more in the nearshore environment. So that might be one criteria. Another criteria we've been thinking about is human activity and how much boat activity is there? How likely are the birds to be flushed again and again? Alcids are very heavily wing loaded. And if you're flushed again and again, that's going to be really costly to you. And there's a number of studies, particularly on murrelets, looking at the effects of boat activity on murrelets. Particularly, there was a nice study on kittlets as murrelets up in Alaska, and has some serious consequences in terms of energy output. The other thing might be, does it have the appropriate soil? Those kinds of questions. How close is it to an existing and extant colony? And the first work we're talking about trying to do is actually bring them into part of a colony that's already occupied, but bring them into an area that is not currently being used, and try using social attractions. You put out decoys and you try to lure them to that place and see if they'll take to it. And you can put in artificial burrows as well.
So another question about the population of rhinoceros auklets. You mentioned both that they seem to be increasing, but also that we've had some of these major die-off events. Do you have the population trend data for the rhinoceros auklets?
We do and we don't. So we get trend data for species in a variety of different ways. I have at-sea data these are surveys that are done at the rigorous statistical design. They're done the same way year after year, and I can look at trends within that. So it tells me the number of birds on the water. We have colony-based data using a stratified random approach where we have a variety of points. And that tells us how many is the occupancy rate, the density essentially of occupied burrows, has that changed over time? So it's another way of looking at trend. The other thing we don't do this as often because it's just a lot harder, is maybe periodically we were going to do whole island estimation. So where you go to the colony, and in this case, like protection, we use a stratified random approach where we populate the island appropriate suitable habitat with random dots. We go to all of those dots and say, okay, how many are within a given radius? We use a 2.5 meter radius. How many of those are also occupied? And then we use that to estimate, extrapolate up to the whole colony. So I'm sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but there are a lot of different ways of looking at trend.
Right. Lots of people saying that it was a very interesting talk, how much they enjoyed it. Lots of kudos in the chats there. Okay. One more question here. What time of year would you expect to see the juveniles? She was on a boat this July and only observed adults at the end of July at Solander Island. This would be Puffins.
That sounds right. And you tend to not see the juveniles until really till mid-August is when we see them. And usually you don't really see them because they disappear from around the island almost immediately. So they seem to really take off. They don't hang out around the base of the island.
And would the juveniles be like the winter plumage
Yes.
one? So they they would
We-
not
that-
stand out on
that's
the
right.
the water.
There'll be that really dark plumage.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this presentation, Scott. It was amazing. Louise is in the room. I don't know if she has anything that she wants to add or say.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what, if Louise wants to say something. Sorry, Louise, to point out
Oh.
you were there.
That's fine. What should I say? I mean, as Scott said, Greg McClelland and I have just finished this paper looking at long-term status and trends of tufted puffins in BC, and we found a similar pattern of disappearance of small colonies and contraction northward as has been found in the States. This is over sort of 100 years, so a fairly long term, but that hasn't been done for BC before, so it was interesting to see those similarities.
Great, well, thank you. And yeah, so this is a fantastic talk. A lot of people giving you very good comments and, like I say, kudos. And so thanks again so much, Scott, for coming and doing this for us tonight.
Well, thank you. I
Appreciate it very much.
really appreciate it. It's nice to visit with you all.
Okay, I'm going to turn the recording off now, and then you can say what you really want to say.